G'day expats and welcome to another episode of Expat Chat. Today I'm joined by a person far better looking than James Ridley. Jennifer Wood is on the screen for those who are watching on YouTube. Jennifer's the Managing Director of the AusVisa Link immigration agency. She's joined with us from Australia at the moment, previously from Dubai. G'day Jennifer.
Hi Brett, how's it going?
Well, thanks. We're in the race to the end of the year and I think people's lists are getting longer and the days are getting shorter. So we're all time poor these days.
Yeah, I'm not really sure where 2020, 2021 went actually. So kind of a bit of a, I don't know.
We had this debate with clients and we're not sure whether it's an issue of because 2020 was slowed down through lockdown, whether this is the normal pace, this was what it was like in 2019, or whether it's just been a crazy year.
Yeah, and I do wonder what 2022 is going to offer, whether it will be the same or are we going to kind of move back to business as usual, or has business actually changed more broadly as well? So it will be interesting to see what happens. Obviously, we've had some highs and lows again in 2021, and I'm really hoping we have more highs than lows next year, which would be great.
Yeah, we've had enough of the lows. It's time for some highs and time for some enjoyment. And I think that's the message I think it's coming out from everyone is just stability. I think people are exhausted by all the changes and, it's on again, it's off again, this is that. Whereas to me, even if we get an Omicron or another one, a new or whatever the new version is going to be called, it's just maintaining the status quo and people have the ability to plan their lives, whether it's for travel, whether it's for relocation, whether it's for whatever it is. People can just have that peace of mind knowing that they can do X and, it's not going to change 5 minutes before they're looking at doing it.
Yeah, absolutely understand.
So, and that's virtually the purpose of the call today because a lot of folks out there need to know more information on the immigration side. There's a lot of mixed nationality marriages with Australian expats and whether it's PR or, I'll let you go through and sort of, talk about the gamut of different options for expats. But purpose of today's call is really just to provide a bit of meat on the bones when it comes to people's options and helping them make informed decisions. So I'll throw the first question out to you and we'll get the show on the road. So in terms of visa streams, what are available in Australia and how does it affect Australian expats and all their partners or spouses?
Yeah, really good question. So, if you go onto the Home Affairs website, you'll actually find there's any number of different visas. And whilst, Home Affairs is great in terms of giving a really good, broadly speaking, this is what a visa is all about and these are the kind of streams that are available. The information is somewhat vague and limited. So it leaves a lot of people really wondering like, well, which visa stream do I fit into? And essentially, if you're going to be, applying for a visa, it's a lot of money. It's an investment. It's certainly a major milestone for a lot of people. So you want to make sure that you do get it right. You want to make sure that you can narrow down the correct visa pathway as well. So, there's more than 100 visas for Australia, and ultimately the Australian government wants to see a reduction and a simplification of those visa streams as well, because it is really confusing and a lot of people try and DIY it. They get it wrong and then they come to me, but or go to another agent. But essentially, you're looking at about around 5 streams. Well, 5 major categories, of which then a lot of different visas come from. So you're looking at exactly. So you've got like a family subclass or a stream, and then there's certain subclasses that come off it: business and investment, employer sponsorship, study and visitor. Really, those are the main categories. So you really have to kind of choose one of those and then work your way down to what is the most appropriate category thereafter. So most of the visas I deal with, and really in 2020, 21, the Australian government wasn't looking at a lot of those visa streams because, obviously borders had been restricted. Employers were really forced to look at Australian citizens and permanent residents over and above skilled migrants. So really that general skilled migration and employer-sponsored pathways were shut down. And we really haven't seen a lot of, many visa invitations for those subclasses as well. So ultimately, people have been restricted to look at other visa subclasses or just to kind of bide their time abroad before they look at migrating to Australia. So a lot of my work has really come through that family visa stream. So people who are repatriating back to Australia more immediately, people who really hadn't thought about obtaining a visa for their spouse or family member, but have been forced with obviously the pandemic has found people without employment abroad or having to look to move back to Australia more immediately. So we've had to really consider a family visa, which in most cases has been partner visas, to be honest. And that's been such an in-demand visa subclass that, processing times have really been pushed out as well. But it is probably the majority of my work right now, although we will see in 2022 skilled migration actually opening up in Australia, as well as obviously the influx of international students coming back into Australia, which is going to be great because, students really do fill a lot of those areas in the labour market that Australian citizens, permanent residents really aren't prepared to fill. And a lot of businesses have actually declined or had to shut down as a result of just not having the staff available. So there's going to be big changes in 2022, but ultimately where my focus has been is around that family visa stream, partner visas particular.
Because Canberra did say they're going to prioritise, that side, didn't they? And they opened up the amount of slots, or I just heard through the grapevine that people were quite surprised by the processing time for a PR was coming through a lot quicker than normal. Is that right?
It really has fluctuated. So onshore partner visas were actually coming through. When we say onshore, it means people who are applying for a partner visa inside of Australia. We were seeing processing times definitely much sooner than what we'd ever experienced before. In some cases, I was getting grants within a week to a month to a couple of months, whereas previously it had taken, between 12 to 24 months to get even the application assessed. Offshore partner visas were moving pretty quickly, but as you can imagine, a lot of the offshore offices for Home Affairs have been running through skeleton staff, so processing has slowed. And we've seen a lot of the offices actually starting to process different types of visas. So Amman office is actually now responsible. So Amman Jordan is now responsible for all of our GCC applicants. Okay. So people who are resident in the GCC, whereas previously it used to be Dubai. Dubai is now an integrity office only. And I think a lot of people probably don't know that. They think they can go down to the consulate in Bergerman and speak to a case officer and get their matter resolved. It's just not the case anymore. Everything is going through Jordan. It's almost like a satellite office where they have delegates who assess in Jordan, but they are assessing applications more globally. So it's not as streamlined as what people might think.
Have you found they're prioritising certain countries, certain types of visas over than others? Or, if you're coming from the US, say, versus the UAE, do you have a better chance, or is it pretty much just based on the application itself?
It really is post by post. So Home Affairs does have broadly they advertise processing times for a global allocation. There's offices that are processing much faster than other offices. So for example, Washington Post for USA, they obviously process a lot of the visas within the region. They have their own set region. They process very quickly, as does the UK. Whereas Jordan, so Amman office is processing around that, I'm going to say 12 to 18 months. Hong Kong office, pretty well the same. I found Jakarta is processing incredibly quickly. So it really depends. It's case by case. If applications are decision ready, so that means that they've been lodged with health and character requirements, the application is very well evidenced, they meet the criteria, really, there should be nothing stopping an assessment officer or a delegate, they say, to pick up that application and to decide it upon initial assessment. That's what you want. But obviously, if the application isn't well evidenced or there's information missing, it's going to delay a process. And a lot of people think that the application is put back to the bottom of the pile. Well, there's actually no physical pile because it's all electronically lodged.
Yeah.
They're actually, and they're placed in queues. So, if the application has had information requested, it will go into another queue that we picked up at some point in time by a delegate. And in the past, where applications were actually assessed by a particular assessment officer, they are now under what's called collective case management. So it means that any delegate who works for Home Affairs can literally log on to a queue, just as you would if you're working in a call center, I guess, and pick up an application and assess it because they all have the skill set that can allow them to do that. So I think there was always a misconception that, you know, I have a case officer assigned to my matter and I need you to contact them directly. Well, that's definitely not the case, not anymore.
And it's sort of, you know, I think there's a lot of similarities between financial planning and immigration in that sense that people can do 80% themselves, but it's that last 20% that gives you that difference. And certainly in your line of work, people could do an application by themselves, but they may experience unnecessary delays and you know, they don't know what they don't know. Whereas you sitting at the coalface, you deal with this stuff on a daily basis. You can anticipate problems. You can look for the tripwires and the landmines and say, okay, no, we're going to do this based on your situation because of this, this, and this. Whereas I often find that the government websites aren't the most user-friendly or sympathetic towards the end user. And whether they do that for a reason or whether it's just poor communication, but certainly your ability to read between the lines just makes that process a lot smoother. So, you know, running through the next lot of questions, you know, in terms of the benefits of having a visa prior to relocation, do you recommend an onshore or an offshore approach? What's the best way in your experience?
It's generally the first question I ask a client or a prospective client is, you know, what are your timeframes? When are you looking to move back to Australia? Because that's really going to determine what visa you should be applying for. If we take, say, for example, partner visas, and someone says to me, look, I have a visitor visa already. My family and I are looking to repatriate to Australia, say, within the next 1 to 3 months. I'd say, well, let's hold back, get you into Australia and lodge an onshore partner visa, because there's no way in the current environment that an offshore partner visa is going to be decided ahead of your planned travel to Australia. Whereas if someone says to me, look, I'm pretty happy in the UAE, for example, I've got stable employment here, my kids are in school, we don't really have any immediate plans to move back, but we would like to approach this in a really planned way, I would say, well, let's lodge an offshore partner visa, let it kind of tick along in the background, be granted ahead of any kind of planned move. And at least then you've got that visa in your back pocket. You don't need to kind of think about visas if and when you do decide to move on to Australia, because, you know, everyone's circumstances change. Last year was a really clear indication of the fact that people hadn't done any migration planning beyond, say, for example, the GCC.
Yep.
And they had to find a visa pretty quickly, and it was near impossible in a lot of situations to do that. So, yeah, obviously having that that visa in your back pocket, having it prior to any kind of move, allows you to move on from any region, whether that be the UAE or Hong Kong, the UK, wherever you might be abroad, and do it in a really planned way. Because obviously I know I've moved on from the UAE, and it sounds simple, but there's quite a few moving parts that have to occur before you even leave the country. So you want to make sure that you're not having to focus on a visa process, but rather dealing with in-country matters before you move on to Australia. But, you know, I guess the ability to enter Australia right now is really determined on what kind of visa you hold, but also whether you are an immediate family member of an Australian citizen or permanent resident. So having a visa for Australia ahead of time is certainly going to give you that ease and accessibility to Australia over and above somebody who has to go through the visa process or move on more immediately. It does give you, say, for example, if you get a permanent resident visa, you would have unrestricted and unlimited study rights. So it means that, yeah, if you wanted to move on to Australia, say in 2022, you've got your visa, you can actually start making contact with employers. And you can say, look, actually, I do have a permanent resident visa. And it's almost like a big tick in the box and moves you on to the next stage.
That's huge.
As opposed to if you say, look, I'm a skilled migrant, I don't have a permanent resident visa right now, but I'll get it in the future. It's kind of like, come back and see us when you do have a permanent resident visa. So that's a huge advantage to people who, may be supporting their family and looking to make that move to Australia an easier move, and certainly having something to go to rather than hitting the ground and going, right, where am I going to find a job? It does give you unrestricted study rights as well. So you won't be paying international fees, which are huge. I mean, university is way more expensive now than when I went to uni.
Yep.
But it certainly allows you to kind of consider those costs if you wanted to do study in Australia. If you had older children who were looking to do, university studies in Australia, it's certainly going to help. It does allow the person who has the permanent resident visa to be a sponsor. They could sponsor other people, other family members to migrate to Australia as well. So that's a huge advantage, particularly maybe in that parent visa stream, because a lot of people are now considering family, bringing family together, particularly with COVID. I think it really highlighted making sure we're close, because we've all been geographically separated from friends and family over the last 2 years, and it hasn't been fun. So, having the ability to sponsor a family member and to move them closer to you is a really great advantage as well. You can make investments in Australia. That's kind of more your wheelhouse than mine. But, in looking to, purchase property, that's been a huge thing. Property market in Australia is booming.
Crazy.
I live in Queensland, and we have just seen like astronomical prices. It's just
stupid.
I'm happy because equity in my home growing up, but like for people who had been sitting on, do I buy, do I not buy, they've been really surprised, maybe more shocked with the property prices. And it's really now is when you want to get in and buy a property. So having a permanent resident visa is always going to be advantageous here, because banks certainly look more favourably upon someone who has Australian citizenship or permanent residency over and above a foreign investor, because you have to consider FIRB and other kind of costs and, LMI and that kind of thing. So, that's an advantage certainly to have that ahead of time, particularly if you want to purchase property with the view of living there, or even just making an investment in the future in Australia. And I guess at the end of the day, if you are looking to get an Australian passport, which a lot of people are, because the Australian passport's pretty strong. It's maybe not as strong as, say, the British passport or maybe New Zealand passport, but it's certainly very strong. And for some people who have passports from, countries where they have to apply for visas, all the time, or they find great difficulty in getting into a country purely based on their passport, Australian passport's not a bad one to have. And you can actually have multiple citizenships. Even if you have Australian citizenship, a lot of people think you have to renounce citizenship of your home country if you do confer Australian citizenship. It's just not the case. Australia actually acknowledges and recognises multiple citizenships. Maybe the country where you're coming from, your home country may not allow you to have multiple citizenships, but that's on you to negotiate or to disclose to them. But certainly having Australian citizenship is going to give you that stability, and you kind of touched on that before in terms of having a home country. And for some people whose home countries are at civil war or just really insecure right now, unstable, it's well worth having permanent residency so you can work towards citizenship, which is really not that long. It's 4 years continuous residence in Australia before you're actually eligible for citizenship, which is really quite short compared to some countries.
The price of admission is pretty not too hard. Yeah,
so I guess investing in a visa for Australia, particularly a permanent resident visa, you're working your way towards citizenship, and that investment really is an investment in a passport and a citizenship moving forward. So it's not a bad idea to kind of think about visas ahead of any kind of move to Australia.
And people who are considering applying for a visa, would you say having economic ties to Australia helps in that process? So if you had an idea of, okay, in 5 or 10 years' time, we're going to move back to Australia permanently, let's try and map this out. Should we start accumulating assets in Australia so then when we do lodge our PR application, will that benefit them? Will they not take into account? How does that work?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. A lot of people say, if I go and purchase a property, is that going to strengthen my application? No, not necessarily. I mean, it's great to be able to invest in Australia for sure, but that's a very, very personal decision and something that you would do in cooperation with, a financial advisor as well, or maybe a broker. But in terms of a permanent resident visa, it ultimately depends on the type of visa that you are applying for. So if you're looking at any of the family visa streams, no, it really has very little bearing on the application. What probably would have a stronger ground there would be if you had joint assets, with your partner. So then if you're looking at the partner visa stream, and I don't want to just focus on partner visas, but if we're looking at partner visa, there is an element that you have to evidence, which is financial or joint finances between you. So if you have a joint property, great, that's one big tick. But it's certainly not going to strengthen your application. If, for example, though, you get a permanent resident visa and there's a 5-year travel facility attached to a permanent resident visa, which allows you to really come and go from Australia as much as you please. Once the 5-year travel facility hits, in order to re-enliven or to reignite your permanent residency, you actually need to show that you have substantial ties to Australia. And that kind of comes back to your question, like, would it actually help? Well, yes, it would in the future if you want to continue your permanent resident visa status or your eligibility to re-enliven permanent residency. You know, having Australian citizen children, Australian citizen spouse is great. Certainly strengthens an application to continue that permanent residency if you are looking at remaining abroad as an expatriate. But having property certainly shows that you've got a financial investment in Australia. However, you know, as you talked about, I think I've read some of the information you've put out to some of your listeners about, you know, the new tax implications which are being proposed for expatriates who are, you know, looking
the 45-day rule.
I guess, yeah, it's such a grey area right now, and I think everyone's kind of getting very nervous about it, but it hasn't been passed. So we'll see what happens, and in that space, that may actually deter people from making investments in Australia. It may actually really change that, you know, landscape in terms of people investing in Australia, but also how they would evidence substantial ties to Australia for a future visa application. I guess it's kind of one of those spaces we have to watch and see. I mean, it's not a space I like to get involved in, and it's certainly I don't want it to deter people from getting a permanent resident visa, because there's loads of benefits that come with that. But at the end of the day, you have to make the decision which best suits your family. And if you're in a tax-free haven, you kind of have to really consider those options moving forward.
So just talk me through the PR process. So I apply for permanent residency, I get granted that. Let's start from the beginning. Do I have to enter Australia within a certain amount of time of being granted PR?
Yeah, so there are a lot of visas which they're a two-stage process. So you have a provisional and a permanent visa combined in the process, and generally you pay up front for the visa, both visas at the same time. Partner visa is a great example of that. You apply for if you're applying offshore, it's a 309-100. The numbers are the visa subclasses, and then onshore it would be 820-801. So you apply for both of them at the same time, but depending on the nature of your relationship will actually determine whether you're able to get both visas up front or whether you actually need to wait out a period until you're actually eligible for permanent residence. Now, the permanent resident visa the provisional will be assessed, and then if it's the permanent resident visa, the applicant is eligible for that visa, then that will be decided, you know, operationally one after the other, almost immediately, in fact. Now, there is an initial entry period which comes with any kind of permanent resident visa, and it's usually within 12 months of the visa being granted. So someone the visa holder would need to make an entry to Australia. Just purely passing through the border is enough to activate the visa, essentially. You don't need to stay in Australia for any set period of time. To, you know, at the point of activation, you could literally walk through the border, jump on another flight and say, see you later.
5 minutes in Australia.
You know, there has been a lot of flexibility though with that initial entry, given COVID, border restrictions, flight costs have been ridiculous. And, you know, I think the Australian government really is mindful that in the past 2 years that people shouldn't be making an entry to Australia for initial activation of their visa if they don't really have an intention of repatriating or relocating, because, you know, they want to free up those flight loads for people who are in that situation and really not put people at unnecessary risk of contracting COVID or, you know, having to do hotel quarantine. It's an additional cost. Obviously, that's kind of not really relevant now because we are removing hotel quarantine in Australia, but certainly, you know, the flight costs are still pretty high. So there is an initial entry facilitation where you can actually push out that initial entry date of the 12 months to, you know, elect another date that you might be able to come into Australia. So that's how that works. And then really, yeah, every permanent resident visa has a 5-year travel facility on it. So you could literally apply for a permanent resident visa, say partner visa, and you could continue to live outside of Australia but still holding that permanent resident visa to give yourself that 5-year, I guess, window where you are going to be planning to return to Australia. The reality is that when you apply for a permanent resident visa, you are looking to make Australia your home. So the 5 years is really in consideration of the fact that people do have to pack up their lives and move to Australia. But it also gives them the opportunity to work to Australia towards Australian citizenship if and when they do get to Australia in that 4-year continuous period. But there's plenty of people who apply for permanent resident visas and just continue to remain abroad, and that's fine.
Yeah,
because
they're sort of
the
in their
beauty
back
of a lot
pocket,
of
isn't it?
those,
Yeah,
exactly, and it gives them that flexibility where they can approach the move to Australia in a really planned way because, things change. People get job opportunities. It's just not the right time for them to migrate, but they certainly want to have that safeguard of having that visa if and when something does happen. And, COVID was a really big indication of that. People just didn't plan for it.
So let's say, for example, you get PR, you enter Australia, you get the stamp in the passport, you bang back out of Australia, you're coming up to that 5-year mark. You touched on before, you can look at requesting extension, and that's when that sort of you may be able to use economic ties to Australia to try and support that argument.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, that's good. So it gives people, it's not just a hard and fast black and white sort of scenario of, use it or lose it. There is that ability to extend.
Absolutely. And to be honest, like if you apply for a partner visa, it's an indefinite visa pathway for Australia. So you never have to apply for another permanent visa. You can always re-enliven a permanent resident visa. So for example, I have a client who's in the USA. She was living in Australia up until like 2013, relocated back to the US with her Australian citizen spouse for economic reasons. She's now looking to move to Australia, back to Australia more permanently, 2021, 2022. We are able to re-enliven her permanent resident visa as a result of her having those substantial ties to Australia, as in she has an Australian citizen child as well as Australian citizen partner. They also have economic ties in Australia. So that might be a property or investment. So in that case, like that should show you that there is really no disadvantage to applying for a partner visa if you could always re-enliven it.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's sort of having that that trump card in the back pocket that you can play it, when and wherever suits. But as you say, you've got to get your ducks in a row in the lead up to having that ability. And I had this conversation with a client the other day who he's Australian, she was European. And they were discussing the whole Portugal visa. They've just closed that down, but that was an option. They were considering that.
Mm-hmm.
And I said to him, look, if you look at the cost of what you have to do to get Portuguese residency and potentially passports and those sort of things, and the cost of actually going through Australia's far cheaper. And he himself admitted that they don't really like Portugal. so I said, well, you're about to spend, what was it, $200,000, to get access,
wow, that's incredible.
to that residency in Portugal. I know for a fact, Australia's not cheap, but it's not even a massive percentage of that. So it's funny how people have this predication to wanting to collect passports now. When in actual fact, as you said, the Australian passport is highly ranked when it comes to the ability to travel unfettered around the world.
That's
but
right.
It sounds cool to have 2 and 3 citizenships, but at the end of the day, do you need it?
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. And, you're right, actually. Australia is incredibly, I think we give a lot of benefits, and we do have a lot of visas available for people who are looking to make the move. And it is a lot cheaper than a lot of other countries. I know the UK is incredibly expensive if you went down the partner visa pathway there. And there's other countries, like if I wanted to move to Spain, for example, I mean, I have no partner from Spain, but I think I have to make an investment of around 500,000 euro to get a visa, which I would love. I don't have that kind of cash sitting around, unfortunately, but I would gladly do, but I just wish it was a bit cheaper. Whereas Australia, yes, the partner visa is expensive currently at $7,850. But it means that you're always going to have indefinite access to Australia, and you can always re-enliven that permanent residency. So it's an investment in your future. I guess that's the way you have to sell it.
Well, if you can invest 500,000 euros and get a 10% rate of return, that's 50,000 euros a year. So once again, you're not even close to looking at a return on capital. You're not even close to what it costs in that one-off cost to apply for PR.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, I definitely think there's benefits to having a visa for Australia. Yes, we're geographically a long way from a lot of other countries, but we have had it pretty good in the last 2 years. As much as we felt really isolated and suffocated here in Australia because we haven't been able to depart, we've had it really good in terms of COVID. I mean, in Queensland, we haven't even felt the effects of COVID really, and it's been great. I mean, New South Wales and Victoria have been smashed, but particularly Victoria. But ultimately, the rates in Australia are far less than what we've seen overseas. And, Australia's made some pretty tough calls in terms of border closures. So we have felt really protected and safe here. Who knows what's going to happen when borders reopen, but I feel that this is a great time for people to start applying for visas. I know there was a bit of a lull. People were like, well, what's the point of applying for a visa if I can't even get into Australia? But there's a real benefit to being pre-planned about these things, particularly when you've got family members that you're moving to Australia. There's plenty of people who have spouses that have children as well who, are maybe not part of the relationship, but have come into the relationship. They need visas as well. And, that's all part of the process. And the benefit of, say a partner visa is it can actually include all of their children in the application as well. So it's a kind of one shot,
one in all,
one model fits all. Yeah, absolutely. So it's a good visa to have. But, as I said, I don't just work with partner visa applicants. I also work with skilled applicants. And, whilst I know that there's a lot of opportunity abroad, Australia we really need skilled migrants at this point in time. There's a lot of areas in Australia that need to grow. We've got the Olympics coming, in the near future. But we have a lot of areas, particularly in IT and engineering, which are really booming and need to come a long way. And we don't have, people in Australia with those skills that can fill those positions. So, I'm really hoping that 2022 and beyond allows us to really increase that skilled market. And, there's also people looking to make investments and open up businesses in Australia. So there's visas that accommodate for that as well. A lot of people are looking at also moving their parents back to Australia as well. So parent visas has been a huge, visa stream that's seen quite an increase in the last year. And, it's not a bad visa stream to go about as well. There's certainly visas that people can apply for when they enter Australia on a visitor visa as a parent. So it just allows you to keep your family together.
Yeah, and I think that's the message that everyone's sort of taking out of the pandemic is that connectivity and that ability to touch. Like we said before, Zoom is great. It does 80% of the job, but nothing beats that physical interaction when it comes to spending time with family and sharing those things. And hopefully things will improve through to 2022 and we get a bit of a normalized scenario. But, as you say, having that ability to be able to move the family, and when I say the family, the extended family is a fantastic option.
Yeah, 100%. And why wouldn't you if the visa's open for them? And it's a reason. It's not. Look, parent visas aren't cheap visas, but at the end of the day, the reason why it's such an expensive visa stream for parents is because the Australian government recognises that as you get older, you need a greater level of healthcare. Yeah. And so when you pay for that visa, you're actually in advance paying for your healthcare in Australia, because if you get a permanent resident parent visa for Australia, you have unrestricted, unlimited access to Medicare.
Yep. And look, we all know Australia's got a massive, health system, which is, by world standards at the top, especially when you talk to clients in the US and what they have to go through living in the US with their health services. But, I think it's a big thing. It's always a consideration in terms of even not in a pandemic with a healthcare crisis going on, but just generally, we all get old. We all need more service and maintenance. And, the Australian system is well designed for it.
Yeah, and I don't know if you do, but actually in applying for a partner visa, whether it's onshore or offshore partner visa, you're actually eligible at the point of application for a partner visa to apply for Medicare. So say, for example, somebody was living abroad with their family, they've applied for a partner visa. Their family had to move back to Australia more immediately. They got a visitor visa to come onshore and await for their, offshore partner visa to be decided. Upon arriving in Australia, they can actually apply for Medicare. So it gives them that buffer and I guess reassurance that even though it's not ideal to be moving to Australia ahead of the partner visa being decided, they are still very well supported.
Yep.
And I think
They've
just
got
in
that
terms
peace
of
of mind.
COVID, like absolutely, and just having access to medical and not having to cover those costs as well is huge.
It is. And I think, that Medicare conversation is one that causes a lot of confusion with expats, whether using Medicare classifies you as a resident,
Oh, yeah.
non-resident. By the strict letter of the word, it doesn't. But because the current residency rules are written in 1936, there's, as you said before, it's a very grey space in terms of qualifying and not qualifying as a resident versus non-resident. I've never seen a case, and we look at all the case studies that go through the ATO. I've never seen the ATO, stipulate someone is a resident for tax purposes because they use a Medicare card, but could it open you up for further investigation like that? And it is a Pandora's box, and certainly with the new residency rules that were proposed back in May this year, that's going to make it more of a binary black and white sort of decision, which is great. It's going to remove all that doubt. As far as Medicare is concerned, if, whether you're resident or non-resident, it comes down to the expiry date on your card. So if you've got 5 years left and you've been overseas for 2 years, potentially, yes, as far as they're concerned, you could do it. If you call it the ATO, they'll say, you're not paying the Medicare levy, so really you shouldn't do it. But it's always that but, there's that grey space, which is probably the good thing about the new rules coming in. And that's actually a nice little segue on to, the next question we've got is, does holding PR make you an Australian tax resident?
No, it doesn't. Presently, it doesn't make you a resident for tax purposes. So it just means that you are able to enter Australia as a permanent resident visa holder. So, unless you have other information, my understanding is no, it doesn't make you resident for tax purposes. At the end of the day, even as an Australian citizen or permanent resident, when you do depart Australia and become an expatriate, you actually do notify the ATO that you are a non-resident of Australia. So, upon returning back to Australia, whether you're a citizen or permanent resident visa holder, once you become usually resident, that's when you would be taxed, taxable in Australia. So, ultimately, it'll be interesting to see what happens with these new proposed laws, like in terms of expatriates and the length of stay in Australia. But just coming back for a visit as a permanent resident visa holder isn't going to mean that you are having to pay tax on any offshore earnings. It's always good to get advice from a financial advisor, just in terms of whether you are liable or not for any kind of interactions that you have in Australia in terms of finances. But, it's only when you actually become usually resident, so you establish yourself in Australia, that becomes your abode, and they call it domiciling yourself in Australia. So, that's where it comes down to.
Yeah, I mean, under the current residency rules, it's those 4 tests. It's the resides test, where do you live, the domicile test, what do your behaviours map to? That of an Australian resident, that of a UAE resident, that of a US resident. Third one's obviously 183, and the last one is only applicable to public servants. That's the Commonwealth Super Test. And under the current rules, PR wouldn't have an issue. Under the new rules, that's where it gets a little bit different, because if you are in Australia for greater than 45 days, then you do have these 4-factor tests. And that first factor test is right of abode. So that right of abode is, do you have the ability to arrive in an Australian port and be granted access to Australia? So if you have PR, yes. But then again, you have to fail 2 of the 4-factor tests in order to be classified as a resident. But then it gets even more confusing, because if you reside in a country that has a double taxation agreement with Australia, there's a tiebreaker clause in there that says you can't be a resident of 2 countries. So if you reside in, say, Singapore, US, UK, any of those countries that have a DTA with Australia, you can still breach the 45 days. You can still fail 2, 3 or 4 of the factor tests, but you'll still be considered a resident of the other country because of the DTA. The ones who have to be concerned about are those in the GCC regions and places like Portugal that don't have a DTA with Australia. In that case, forewarned is forearmed, I guess you could say, at the end of the day. So, we're talking to a number of folks at the moment who do have PR, who that is a consideration. But, one of the tests is the economic assets test, and they do have PR, so they do have right of abode, but they're worried about putting assets in Australia. But that's when our job is we go through and break it down into non-taxable assets, which exclusionary of the assets test. So you don't breach. So they can have PR. They can be in Australia for greater than 45 days. They can have assets in Australia as long as they're not taxable Australian property like a house or apartment or a family trust or a business. So we'll run on to the next. Sorry, keep going.
Yeah, I was just going to say, there's also like, people ask whether, and this happens a lot, you have husband and wife or partners, and they have maybe the female and the children go and be usually resident in Australia, whereas the other partner remains abroad and continues to work and share their time between the two countries. I guess that, like laws that you were talking about, they will actually, I guess we're trying to deter people from doing that and actually make that person who's working abroad actually be usually resident in Australia for tax purposes. But the benefit of having a partner visa as well is that partners can live in separate countries. Obviously they can't, it's not like a forever existence. It just means that temporarily they might be living in different countries. So certainly I've seen, wives or, spouses return to Australia with the children, particularly during COVID, and have them continue their education in Australia whilst the spouse lives abroad. So that's possible as well. And you don't need to stay together, but you don't need to be permanently apart is, I guess, what they're looking at.
Yeah. And look, we've already been talking to clients about strategies and how to navigate that 45 days. One of the simplest ways, don't spend greater than 45 days in Australia. And if you do want to spend more time with the family, fly them to Bali, fly them to Singapore, fly them to Phuket. And the cost of that trip will be far less than the tax they would pay as an Australian tax resident. So you can navigate it. You just got to sort of think outside the box and be a little bit creative.
Yeah, 100%.
So, and in terms of the future of Australian migration in the next 12 months, what does it look like? Is it, more PR? Is it going to be skilled? Is it going to be education? Or is this going to be everything?
Well, I'm hoping it's a bit of everything, but first things first, obviously we need to see our borders open. So, we were looking at the 1st of December where everything was really going to open more broadly, but obviously with the new strain, Australian government's obviously looking to do more research and find out a bit more about how this is going to impact on us more generally, and particularly with international arrivals. So 15th of December really is now the milestone of when hopefully borders will reopen. We've seen Victoria and as well as New South Wales really being open now to international flights. There's still flight capping and, the flights, airlines are charging accordingly. Australian government has no power over how much flights are costing people, but there are still caps, and that's just to kind of make sure that we can control incoming arrivals and the spread of COVID. But, hotel quarantine has been removed for Victoria and also New South Wales. There are still countries, so they're usually African countries right now, where you will still have to hotel quarantine just because of a spread of COVID in those countries. Yeah, but look, state borders are looking to open. Queensland, amazing, is actually going to be opening their borders apparently on the 13th of December. So they've moved it forward by 2 days, so we'll see what happens. The Premier often changes her mind on things, so it's really kind of watch this space and see what happens. But ultimately we are seeing things changing. People aren't wearing masks anymore, which is great. But hopefully in terms of migration, what we'll see rather is processing times come down because we're actually openly processing a lot more, hopefully. Offshore offices will start having more staff, not just skeleton staff, processing visas. So we'll see an increase in visa processing in shorter time, less delays. We'll see, greater numbers of visa invitations being given to skilled migrants as well. So that will certainly assist. We talked about it before, international students coming back to Australia, which is huge because that's a huge revenue raiser for Australia.
$36 billion a year to the Australian economy.
Yeah, and so many Australian citizens, permanent residents, were working in those industries here and found themselves without work last year and this year certainly as well. But hopefully 2022 sees, students being able to come back in, and also come the 15th of December, certain visa holders will be able to enter Australia without exemption. So That's amazing. So a lot of people who had general skilled migration visas or some kind of employer sponsored visas are able to make their entry to Australia and really start their life, which is great, because ultimately they've been delaying that move purely because of border restrictions. But ultimately what can we expect is hopefully a greater number of visas. The Australian migration program runs from the 1st of July to 30th of June, so our financial year. So hopefully come the 1st of July 2022, we'll see a much greater quota of visas in particular subclasses than what we have seen presently, and just greater opportunities. I really feel like opening the border is going to be huge. More broadly, people are able to reunite with their family members as well. So I feel like applying for a partner visa or some other type of family visa now is great in preparation for those borders really opening
up. Yeah, and then other people getting on with their life plans, which is always that big one as well too. They've got an intention to emigrate to Australia. That's been on hold, and with things on the improve, which is good, and let's hope. As I say, my region is Shala. It keeps going in the right direction. Then we could hopefully have a result where everything's normalised, and as you say, that capacity increases, the turnaround times improve, and just people get on with their lives.
Yeah, I hope so too. I think it'll be really great.
Yeah, no, exactly. And look, the last question I want to leave it on, and it's often the most important one. And myself and my personal capacity, I always engage professionals. There's that great email or meme that goes around about the company that has the old engine, and they spend tens of thousands of dollars trying to get it working, and then they find the guy who originally built it 50 years ago, and he comes in and looks at it twice and taps 2 spots with a hammer and gives them a bill for 10 grand. And they said, you only spent 10 minutes on it. He goes, you're not buying my 10 minutes, you're buying my skills. And that's the way I liken it to any person, whether you engage an immigration agent, a lawyer, financial planner, an accountant, you're paying for their intellectual property. You're actually not paying for the process. The process is actually quite rudimentary, but it's being able to navigate that process. So in your, I guess, experience, run through a couple of scenarios when, engaging someone like yourself has really paid dividends as opposed to going down the route of the old DIY approach.
Yeah, I mean, I guess probably one scenario that comes to mind here was I had some clients who approached me. They'd done the DIY themselves, and she was a New Zealand citizen. She misunderstood the legislation for a partner visa. She applied for a partner visa for her partner. In fact, she wasn't actually eligible as a sponsor, and they lost nearly $8,000 because the Australian government's not in the game of giving you money back.
No refunds.
Again. So for them, I really wish that they had actually come to me to really, even just to get a consultation, to look at their options before having applied for that visa, because it is a huge revenue raiser for the Australian government, and you want to make sure you get it right. I guess it was a recent scenario. Somebody came to me and they thought they would need to reapply for the partner visa. They'd already been granted it many years ago, and they wanted to make a re-entry to Australia. And they thought, I have to go down this partner visa pathway again. It was much more expensive, now than it was when they first paid for the partner visa. And I said, well, actually, no, you're eligible to re-enliven your permanent residency. So as opposed to paying, $7,850, you're going to pay $410. So that's a huge saver for them. Obviously it's like reading between the lines as well. And, I've had clients who've brought their family, their parents to Australia, for example. They didn't realise that a contributory parent visa was going to cost them near $50,000 per applicant, so per parent. But they were quite happy to remain in Australia on a bridging visa. So instead of paying, nearly $50,000, we paid, $4,000 essentially.
Yep.
So, there's definitely benefits in getting some advice before you invest in a process, because, everyone's all about saving money. I'm about saving my clients money as well.
Yep.
I'm not a money grab. I like to be able to add integrity and certainly value to a process. And if I can't add value, I certainly won't take on a client. But engaging an agent or a migration professional, and you want to make sure that they are a registered agent for the most part, because they do have legal liability as opposed to a consultant.
Yep.
Just gives you that level of protection and assurance as well. But an agent or immigration lawyer, really they're interchangeable. There's really no difference, is that they will help you interpret the legislation because, you know, not everybody is a migration professional, although I've read some forums, people think they are, but, you know, ultimately, you know, that's what I do. That's my wheelhouse. You know, I've been working in this industry for 11 and a half years. I certainly know how to interpret the legislation and make sure that if you are applying for a visa pathway, you're applying for the right one that suits your circumstances. I'm saving you money. I'm saving you time. It's definitely going to streamline the process for you. But a migration agent should provide you with migration advice and guidance to make sure that process is streamlined, it's stress-free. You know, you're getting from A to B. It's not like, you know, I'm applying for it and I might get it 50-50. No, you should get it. Because if you're eligible for the visa stream and you can evidence your claims to that visa, there's really no reason why you shouldn't pass all of that assessment to get that visa. But, you know, adding a migration professional to that process will, you know, essentially allow you to lodge a decision-ready application to avoid delays, to make sure you're applying for the right visa, and you're not going to lose money because ultimately everyone works really hard for their money. You don't want to lose it.
And I think it's the time. You know, it is the time, isn't it? You know, yes, the internet is a great thing, but there's almost too much information on there. But then where your skill set comes in is joining the dots. You know, people can find X, they can find Y, but they don't know how it joins up. And you know, they may come to the wrong conclusion, sort of like Googling, you know, for health symptoms. If you're not feeling well, you read between the lines and you'll have that, what we call in our industry, confirmation bias. You'll convince yourself this is the answer because you've been doing the work and that's the result. When in actual fact, there was that small crack that should have turned left instead of right, and they would have had the result. And you know, and this is, I call it bum and seat time. The more time you spend in the seat, you know, the more experience you have in navigating that space and able to react quickly. And you're not paying for someone to research the issue. They know it. They can tell you in 30 seconds what the answer is. Bang. You know, whereas you may spend 6 hours on a Saturday night Googling and still not have the answer. You know, it's up to people what their time is worth at the end of the day. But I've always said, you know, I always engage a lawyer. I always engage a lawyer to do wills. I don't do the Australia Post, you know, back of the door sort of thing, because you spend the money hoping not having to, you know, to use it. You know, using someone like yourself, it should be a straight through process. And then from their point of view, I'm like, well, why did we use Jennifer? Because you made it a straight through process. It's because they didn't have those pain points along the way that people normally experience when they do it themselves.
Yeah, that's right. And also, like, having an authorized representative is so crucial when it comes to issues that you might, sometimes you don't even realize you're going to encounter an issue in the application process, and it will come up. You know, it can come up at any point. I 100% go in and bat for my clients. And, you know, the fact that I used to work for Home Affairs as well, you know, you're getting someone who's working not only as an agent, but who knows how it works operationally, who knows how to kind of communicate with the department to achieve that outcome, and who knows, you know, all the ins and outs and how operationally it actually works in the department, because you don't get that indication when you're looking at a website. But yeah, in all cases, you know, I definitely represent my clients from start to finish, and I have had to really put it back on the department and draw their attention to particular legislation and policy to make them finalise an application, because everyone's not always across visa subclasses, and you do get case officers who may not know, you know, the ins and outs of that visa as well as you might assume. So having an authorised representative certainly allows you to feel really supported during that process. And I think that's crucial, because you may not have all the tools to respond to a request or a query from the department. And that could really be the difference between you getting a visa or being refused. And again, you know, what's your time worth, but also what's your money worth?
Yeah. And also, if your dream is to go to Australia, do you want to jeopardize that for when you look at the time cost and also the economic cost of what you're looking at? If you're looking at living in Australia for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, whatever that time period is, you know, divide that small upfront cost of working with someone like yourself over that period, amortize it out to get that peace of mind, knowing that Australia is going to be your new home. And that's what I say to clients all the time.
It's an investment in your future.
Bingo. Yeah. Yeah. You need to invest in, if that's what your dream is. If you're going to start up a business, would you put money into it? Yeah. think of this like a business. This is your new business of being an Australian resident, an Australian citizen, and having the benefits that go along with that. You need to invest in that process.
Yeah. That's right. And everyone uses a professional for various reasons. I have an accountant, I have a bookkeeper, I have a financial advisor. You know, these people are in those occupations for a certain reason, and they have that intellectual knowledge that you don't have. We all have our own expertise, and I think it's important to really kind of reach out and to use people out there who are experienced in the area. And, you know, I welcome anybody who has any queries or concerns about migration for Australia. And I'll certainly, even if you don't want to engage my services, I'll point you in the right direction. And I, like you, have a network of professionals who I certainly lean on for advice, and I'm happy to share those contacts as well.
No, that's great. And you know, I'll put all your contact details and everything in the show notes as well.
Yeah,
but,
thanks.
you know, just quickly, just let folks know how they can get hold of you if they just want to start having that chat to get that ball rolling.
Yeah, for sure. Like, to be honest, I work with clients globally. So, and I really make sure that I'm available according to their time schedules, obviously within reason. But I work to my clients. That is very game of you. Yeah. But I work to my clients' availability, because ultimately everybody's scenario is quite different. I'm not a, you know, 8 to 5 kind of worker. I work, you know, after hours as well. But people can always contact me through email, via phone, via WhatsApp. I a lot of WhatsApp. But, you know, a lot of my referrals come through people who I used to work with. So clients I've worked with previously, or professionals like yourself. So I'm always available. I certainly do get on quite a few forums and point people in the right direction if I can see the conversation's not going well or the advice isn't correct. But I'm always open to guiding people through the process, and I'm not a hard sell. You know, certainly people are welcome to go on that process themselves as well. And I'm happy, as I said, to steer them in the right direction.
No, that's fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your time today. You know, this has been invaluable because one thing we love to do out there is squash urban myths and some of the bar talk that goes around. You know, sometimes there is an original root of truth that has been stretched and manipulated, and it might be 10 years old, it might be change of legislation. You know, these things, the goalposts are always moving. So appreciate that. We'll get you back on another call, and we'll probably look at doing a webinar in 2022. Live one. We'll get that interaction with the folks out there, and just help them make informed decisions.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great to speak with you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jennifer, and you have a great day.